Right then, let's get straight to it, shall we? Today, we're undertaking a rather significant exploration, a deep dive into the Apollo 11 mission.
Yes, the big one.
Indeed. Not a mere overview, mind you, but a meticulous look at the flights, the objectives, and, well, the outcomes. We'll be following the timeline quite closely, and this is really aimed at an expert audience, like our listeners.
Quite right. And we've got a fair bit of source material here, haven't we? Your notes, articles, various research, it all points to this pivotal event.
Precisely. And our mission, you could say, for this deep dive is to really pull Apollo 11 apart a bit. Go beyond the headlines, the usual story, and find those salient points for a more nuanced view.
Quite so. To understand not just the what, but the why and the how of it all.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. The genesis of Apollo. It didn't just appear out of nowhere, did it?
No, absolutely not. It was fundamentally linked, intrinsically linked to the Cold War rivalry.
Between the US and the Soviet Union, of course.
The space race, with Apollo sort of this crown jewel, was a direct result of that intense geopolitical competition. It wasn't just exploration for its own sake.
No, it was about proving technological and, I suppose, ideological superiority. Very visible.
Extremely visible.
And you can't talk about that era without mentioning Sputnik 1. 1957. That was a shock, wasn't it?
It really was a huge shock to the American system. The Soviets launching the first artificial satellite. It wasn't widely expected. It created significant anxiety, suggested, potential military capabilities.
Delivering warheads.
Precisely. And it seriously challenged that American assumption of technological leadership. It forced a major rethink of science and education policy in the States.
The so-called Sputnik crisis.
That's the one. And it properly ignited the space race. Both sides were then determined to outdo the other in space achievements.
And the Soviets kept hitting those early milestones, didn't they?
They did. Yuri Gagarin, first man in orbit, 1961. That definitely ramped up the pressure on the U.S. The fear of falling behind was palpable.
So Eisenhower initially responded with NASA Project Mercury, putting an American in orbit.
Yes, but it was Kennedy who really upped the ante. He saw the Soviets had heavier rockets at that point.
Right, they had a lead-in booster capability.
So he set that much bolder goal, land a man on the moon, and return him safely. And crucially, before the end of the decade.
And he knew, didn't he, that this was beyond current rocket technology?
He explicitly said so. He understood it was beyond the capacity of the existing generation of rocketry. That was strategically very clever.
How so?
Well, it leveled the playing field, in a way. It set a goal where the Soviets' existing lead in heavy lift wasn't the deciding factor. Both sides were starting, more or less, from a similar position regarding the specific tech needed for a moon landing.
A challenge where neither side had a massive head start.
Exactly. And he framed it brilliantly, didn't he, as a crucial national objective, a test of will.
That famous speech. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Precisely. That captured the imagination, galvanized effort. He presented it as something that would organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. A challenge they had to meet.
Right, so the political will and the grand objective were there. But achieving it needed hardware. Serious hardware.
Enter the Saturn V.
The B.
An absolute monster of a rocket. The launch vehicle for Apollo 11. Lifted off July 16th, 1969, 13.32 UTC from Kennedy Space Center.
And its job, particularly that second burn of the third stage, the SIVB for the translunar injection, that was critical.
Utterly critical.
Yeah.
TLI. Pushing them out of Earth orbit towards the moon. The sheer size and power of the Saturn V, its development, was the key to meeting Kennedy's deadline. Without it, forget it.
Those F1 engines on the first stage, incredible technology for the time.
Stage combustion, yes. A huge leap. The launch sequence itself was quite something. First stage burn, the SIC, for about 2 minutes, 42 seconds.
Then the SI second stage takes over.
Yes. Firing for roughly another 6.5 minutes until about 9 minutes, 8 seconds after liftoff. Then separation. And the first burn of the SIVB, third stage, to get them into Earth orbit.
And after it did the big TLI burn, what happened to that SIVB stage?
After the crew had performed the transposition and docking maneuver, turning the command service module around to extract the lunar module, the SIVB was sent on a trajectory past the moon.
To get it out of the way.
Exactly. Into a solar orbit, so no chance of it hitting the moon or interfering with the spacecraft later.
Then the launch itself, the spectacle.
Huge. Estimated 1 million people watching from around Cape Canaveral. A massive public event. It really symbolized the national effort.
And those first stage engines, the F1s, they found them recently, didn't they, on the seabed?
They did, remarkably. Recovered and identified. A tangible link back to that immense power.
Quite incredible. And speaking of power, the Saturn V's success really stands in contrast to the Soviets' attempts, doesn't it?
Yes, their N-1 rocket, designed for their own moon landing program, suffered repeated catastrophic failures. The Saturn V's reliability was a major factor in the U.S. winning that particular race to the moon.
Okay, so Saturn V does its job. Apollo 11 is heading moonward, a 3-day trip.
That's right, coasting towards the moon. They entered lunar orbit on July 19th, just after 5 p.m. UTC.
Now, a really key strategic decision had been made years earlier about how to land, the method.
Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR.
Instead of flying straight down or assembling in Earth orbit.
Correct. James Webb, the NASA administrator, announced LOR as the chosen method back in July '62. It was controversial at the time, championed by John Houbolt at Langley.
But why LOR? What was the advantage?
The mass. Fundamentally, it saved a huge amount of weight. You only needed to land a small, dedicated lunar module, the LM, while the bigger command and service modules stayed in orbit. Much less propellant needed overall compared to landing the whole stack.
Made this seemingly impossible possible.
It was arguably the linchpin decision that made Apollo feasible within the decade.
And the spacecraft itself, the 3 main parts.
Yeah, the command module, which they named Columbia, that's where the crew lived for most of the mission. Then the service module attached to it, with the main engine, power, oxygen, that was unnamed.
And the star of the landing.
The lunar module. LM,
Yeah.
nicknamed Eagle, that's the bit that actually went down to the surface.
So they're in lunar orbit. Next up, the descent and landing. And this is where things got, well, hairy.
Extremely hairy, yes. First, the landing site selection. Site 2 in the Sea of Tranquility, Mare Tranquillitatis.
Chosen for safety, primarily. Not necessarily the most exciting spot geologically.
Exactly. For the very first landing, safety and engineering constraints were paramount. They needed somewhere relatively flat, smooth, easy to approach. Scientific interest was secondary for this initial mission.
What were the main criteria they were looking for?
Several things. Smoothness, obviously. Few large craters or boulders. Clear approach paths, free of mountains. Needed to be reachable with minimal fuel burn. Had to allow for launch delays, so stay within the flight plan window. Also, it needed to be on a free return trajectory path, meaning if the main engine failed during lunar orbit insertion, they could still loop around the moon and coast back to Earth.
A crucial safety net.
Absolutely. And visibility was key. The sun angle had to be right, between 7 and 20 degrees. Low enough to cast shadows to help judge terrain, but not so low it hit everything. And finally, a gentle overall slope, less than 2 degrees.
Quite a checklist. How do they find such a place?
Using data from the unmanned lunar orbiter probes, which had mapped the moon in high detail, and the surveyor landers, which gave ground truth, they initially picked 5 potential sites.
And Site 2 won out.
Yes, it ticked the boxes. And crucially, Apollo 10 flew its LM, Snoopy, down to within about 9 miles of Site 2 just 2 months before Apollo 11.
A dress rehearsal.
Effectively, yes. They confirmed it looked suitable from close range.
So confidence was reasonably high. But then Eagle undocked from Columbia.
Yes, July 20th, 17.44 UTC. Collins stayed in Columbia. Armstrong and Aldrin began their descent in Eagle.
And almost straight away they noticed something wasn't quite right.
They reported being long. Their trajectory was taking them further downrange than planned, beyond the designated landing ellipse.
Meaning they'd missed the smooth spot they'd aimed for.
Potentially, yes. They were heading towards rougher ground, and then came the alarms.
The infamous 1201 and 1202 alarms from the LM guidance computer, the LGC.
Yes, that certainly got hearts racing in mission control.
What did those alarms actually mean? Computer failure?
Not exactly failure. They indicated executive overflows. The computer is basically saying, I'm being asked to do too many things at once right now. It had too much data coming in.
Just overloaded.
Temporarily overloaded, yes. But crucially, due to its design, thanks in large part to Margaret Hamilton and her software team, it was programmed to prioritize the essential tasks, like steering and descent, and ignore the lower priority ones causing the overload.
So it was actually doing its job, just signaling it was under strain.
Precisely. But it needed someone in mission control to recognize that and give the okay to continue. That fell to a young flight controller, Steve Bales, relying on guidance from computer specialist Jack Garman.
And Garmin knew the system, knew those alarms weren't necessarily abort conditions.
He did. Based on simulations, he knew the computer could handle these overflows. Bales, trusting Garmin, made the call. Go, multiple times, as the alarms recurred. A huge call.
Absolutely critical. What was causing the overload, though?
The likely culprit was the rendezvous radar switch being in the wrong position. It wasn't needed for landing, but if left on, it fed unnecessary data to the computer, which is also processing crucial landing radar data. Too much information.
Incredible. Human error potentially causing a computer overload, which the computer itself managed to handle.
In essence, yes. But the drama wasn't over.
Because Armstrong realized where the computer was taking them.
Exactly. As they got lower, he saw the autopilot was aiming for the edge of West Crater, a field strewn with boulders the size of cars. Not a good place to land.
So he had to intervene.
He took semi-automatic control. He controlled the pitch and roll, manually guiding the LM, essentially flying it horizontally, searching for a safer spot, while Aldrin called out altitude and velocity readings.
All while the fuel was running dangerously low.
Critically low. Mission Control was getting very tense warnings about fuel levels. 60 seconds. Then 30 seconds of fuel remaining.
Must have been agony back in Houston.
You can hear it in the recordings. But Armstrong stayed calm, focused, found a clear patch.
And then?
Aldrin called contact light. One of the probes hanging below the landing pads had touched the surface. Then Armstrong confirmed. Shutdown. They were down. 20.1.4 years UTC, July 20th.
With how much fuel left?
Estimates vary, but likely only about 25 seconds worth of hovering time left. Maybe a little more, maybe less. Very, very close.
And Armstrong's first words from the surface.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Utter relief in Mission Control.
An understatement, I imagine. Right, so they're safely down. Then came the EVA, the moonwalk.
Yes, although preparing for it took longer than planned. About 3.5 hours, not the scheduled 2. Getting suited up, depressurizing the cabin, organizing everything in that cramped space. It was complex.
Understandable. And then the hatch opened.
OOF 2.39 UTC on the 21st. Armstrong squeezed out first. It was apparently quite awkward getting through the hatch in the bulky suit. His heart rate was pretty high during egress and ingress.
Understandably.
He started down the ladder at 02.51, pulled a lanyard to deploy the equipment bay on the side of the LM, which contained the TV camera.
Giving the world that ghostly black and white view.
That's the one. Slow scan TV, but revolutionary for its time. And then at 02.56.15 UTC, the first step.
That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind.
Indeed. Though the debate about whether he said a man or just man continues. He always maintained he intended to say a man.
What were his first impressions? What did he say about the surface?
He described the surface dust as very fine-grained, almost like powder, easy to kick up. One of his very first actions was collecting the contingency sample.
Just scoop up a bit of soil quickly.
Yes, put it in a pocket on his suit, just in case they had to make an emergency liftoff. They'd at least have something from the moon.
Smart. And then Aldrin joined him.
About 19 minutes later, Aldrin came down the ladder, looked around, and his famous description was magnificent desolation.
Captures it well. How did they find moving in 1/6 gravity? Was it like the simulations?
They said it was actually easier than they expected, less awkward than the simulations. They found a sort of loping gait. Kangaroo hops almost was the best way to get around, though the soil was surprisingly slippery underfoot.
Then came the flag planting.
Yes, the symbolic stuff. Planting the U.S. flag. That proved a bit tricky. The ground was harder just below the surface than they thought. They couldn't get the pole in very deep.
Worried it might fall over.
Alder mentioned that, yes. Then President Nixon called them via Houston. A rather surreal moment, talking to the president from the moon.
Unprecedented. But they had science to do as well, the ESEP experiments.
Right, the early Apollo scientific experiments package. Not as extensive as later missions, but important first steps. They deployed a passive seismometer to listen for moonquakes.
Did it detect any?
Yes, it transmitted data for a few weeks, detected some small events, possibly impacts or venting gas, and they set up the laser-ranging retroreflector array.
Which we still use today.
Absolutely. Allows incredibly precise measurements of the Earth-Moon distance by bouncing lasers off it from observatories on Earth. Still operational.
What else did they do on the surface?
Armstrong went for a short walk over to what they call Little West Crater, about 60 meters away, took photos. Aldrin did most of the sample, collecting, hammering core tubes into the ground, though again, hitting hard layers.
Only got about 6 inches down.
Something like that. And collecting rock samples. They gathered about 21.5 kilograms of lunar material in total.
And that material, back on Earth, proved fascinating.
Hugely. Revealed the moon's volcanic past the dark seas like tranquility, or ancient basalt lava flows. They found glassy beads from impacts. And those 3 new minerals were discovered within the samples. Armalcolite.
Named after Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins.
Tranquilityite, named after the landing site, and pyroxferate. Real scientific payoff even from that first short visit.
And they unveiled the plaque on the LM leg.
Yes, before finishing the EVA. Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. Signed by the crew and Nixon.
How long were they actually outside?
The EVA lasted about 2.5 hours in total. Mission Control was watching their metabolic rates, making sure they weren't overexerting themselves. They even got a 15-minute extension.
Then getting the samples back inside the LM, that wasn't straightforward either.
No, the lunar equipment conveyor, basically a strap and pulley system, was apparently quite awkward to use.
Yeah.
They ended up mostly hauling the sample boxes up by hand.
And before leaving the surface, they threw out some rubbish.
Essentially, yes. To save weight for ascent. They're empty life support backpacks, PLSS, units, boots, cameras, tools they no longer needed, all jettisoned onto the surface.
Creating the first archaeological site on another world, I suppose.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And there was that heart-stopping moment with the circuit breaker.
Ah, yes, Aldrin brushing against it.
Accidentally broke the switch needed to arm the main ascent engine. Could have stranded them there.
How did they fix it?
Aldrin realized a felt-tip pen wedged into the hole where the switch was could push the contacts together. Ingenious improvisation under pressure.
Incredible. And they left some mementos behind.
Yes, memorials. An Apollo 1 mission patch for Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Medals for Soviet cosmonauts Gagarin and Komarov who had died. A small gold olive branch replica symbolizing peace. And a silicon disc with goodwill messages from world leaders.
Poignant gestures. Right, so EVA complete, time to leave Tranquility Base.
Liftoff. Eagle's ascent stage fired up at 17.54 UTC on July 21st, after just under 22 hours on the surface.
Using the descent stage as a launch pad.
Precisely. And as they lifted off, the flag.
Aldrin saw it get knocked over by the engine exhaust, confirmed by later analysis of the footage.
A slightly undignified end for that particular flag. Then the critical rendezvous and docking back with Collins in Columbia.
That must have been complex, matching orbits.
Very. Precision flying required. Rendezvous achieved around 21.24 UTC, and they docked firmly about 10 minutes later at 21.35.
Crew and samples transferred back to Columbia.
Yes. Then the Eagle's ascent stage, its job done, was jettisoned. It eventually crashed back onto the moon, but its exact impact site isn't known for sure.
So the full crew reunited, ready for home.
Columbia fired its main engine to leave lunar orbit, began the 3-day coast back to Earth. They even did another TV broadcast on the way home.
Showing the Earth getting larger in the window.
Must have been quite a sight. Splashdown was in the Pacific, July 24th.
Recovered by the USS Hornet, and then straight into quarantine.
Yes, the mobile quarantine facility.
Okay.
A converted Airstream trailer, essentially. They spent 21 days inside as a precaution against hypothetical moon germs.
Which, of course, didn't exist.
No evidence of any lunar pathogens was ever found, but it was considered a necessary precaution at the time.
And the reaction back on Earth must have been phenomenal.
Global euphoria. Huge ticker tape parades in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. They were awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Became instant global icons.
And that phrase entered the language. If they can send a man to the moon, why can't they?
Exactly. It became a benchmark for technological achievement, though often used ironically to question why other societal problems couldn't be solved.
But not everyone was celebrating uncritically.
No, there were criticisms, certainly. Concerns about the vast cost billions of dollars, while problems like poverty and inequality persisted on Earth.
Gil Scott Heron's Whitey on the Moon captured that sentiment powerfully.
It did. A reminder of the different perspectives and priorities within society at the time.
What about the Soviets? How did they react officially?
Publicly, they downplayed the U.S. achievement, focused on their own successful robotic missions like Luna 16, which returned samples automatically later. They didn't publicly acknowledge their own failed crewed lunar program for many years.
A bit of sour grapes, perhaps?
Understandable given the context of the race.
And the legacy today, the physical artifacts.
Well, Columbia, the command module, is a centerpiece exhibit at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. A must-see.
Eagle's descent stage. Still there.
Still at Tranquility Base. It's been photographed from lunar orbit by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. You can see the landing site, the descent stage, even the tracks left by the astronauts.
Amazing. And the Saturn V engines we mentioned?
Recovered, conserved, and displayed. The lunar samples are still actively studied by scientists worldwide, yielding new insights even decades later.
And the mission itself is constantly remembered. Anniversaries, documentaries, films.
It remains a defining moment of the 20th century.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, Apollo 11 was clearly far more than just a single space flight.
Oh, absolutely. Humanity's first steps on another world, driven by that strange, potent mix of Cold War rivalry and breathtaking engineering brilliance.
The level of planning, the ingenuity shown in overcoming those unexpected crises,
Yeah.
it's still staggering.
It really is. The OG SEAL arms, Armstrong taking control, the broken switch, they solve problems on the fly under immense pressure.
Which leads to a final thought, perhaps, for our listeners. Given those enormous technical and logistical hurdles overcome for Apollo 11, what parallels can we draw with the big science or engineering challenges we face today? Climate change, sustainable energy, exploring Mars. What lessons from Apollo might still apply?
That's a fascinating question, isn't it? The power of a clear goal, national will, focused resources, brilliant minds tackling immense complexity. Are those ingredients still relevant? Can we replicate them?
Something to ponder. We certainly encourage everyone to explore the source materials further. It's a story with endless layers. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.